Hey there, this is Albert Alf here. I want to talk a little today about describing music and how can we do that in an educational context. Something I like to do with my students in my high school general music class is we will do something called musical analysis, active listening, right? So we're actively listening to music, doing music analysis, and then the learning objective is to have the students describe what they hear using music vocabulary. Now, I've looked online. There's many different ways to approach doing this. And there's different resources online that give different perspectives on how you can have students describe what they hear musically. And you also have to take into account most of your students in a high school context are not going to really have too much prior musical knowledge. They might have played an instrument in band or ensemble, but in my district, that's very uncommon even for that. So a lot of these kids, you have to realize, are coming in with basically no former knowledge or very little, if any at all. So if you're going to have these kids describing music through active listening, you can't expect them to be able to do anything advanced, like telling you what the chord progression is or the harmony or what key it's in, but you can focus on basics, and there's certain questions you can ask that are very accessible to the general average person. And there are the musical elements, like melody and rhythm and timbre and dynamics and harmony and genre. There's also other musical elements or musical occurrences like riffs and motifs and getting students to hear the difference between major and minor isn't that hard. Major is the happy sound, minor is the sad sound. But if we're trying to get students to describe music and describe what they hear, that's a bit of a challenging situation. Is how do you ask questions that are stimulating higher order thinking while also not asking questions that are going to be over the heads of your average high school student who doesn't have too much prior musical knowledge, if any at all. So how are you going to ask questions that stimulate higher order thinking? How are you going to avoid falling into the pattern of only asking yes or no questions, like does the song contain a riff? Does the harmony sound major or minor? What's the tempo? What style of music can we label the song as? See, these are all basically yes or no questions, or questions with a few answers. But how can we? Because ultimately, we want students to discuss the music. Now, some students who are bright and who are active in your class, so they will be able to discuss the music and be more actively involved in this process, and they'll be able to almost participate in the higher order thinking on their own. But how can you, though, see, the thing is, though, that's just a few of them. But how can you as a teacher, how can you, stimulate that and facilitate that student process so that they can start analyzing the music and describing what they hear and even discussing it in a way that is reminiscent and relevant to higher order thinking and formal operational thinking? Now, there are certain questions that can be asked. If we're talking about melody, one question you could ask is the melody going up or down in pitch, or is it staying more in a middle area? That might sound a little vague, but it does give the students something to think about, just whether they hear the melody going up or going down, or maybe it's just staying around here somewhere. So if they can do that, that's kind of getting sort of where you want to go. That's going in the right direction, where you're not just, because if you just ask the students to describe the music, a lot of them are not really going to know what to say. You could even say describe the music using music vocabulary, using a vocabulary word, and they're not necessarily going to know what to say with that either. So the real question is, how do you, get students to actively describe what they're hearing through active listening? So if we went over melody with rhythm, there's a few things you could ask. You could ask them, well, if you've gone over syncopation, you can ask them, does the rhythm The rhythm patterns, do they contain syncopation? Or how would you describe the rhythm? That sounds a little vague. You know, as rhythm can mean a few different things in certain contexts. But if you ask a student to describe the beat, for example, you know, they might not have a certain adjective they might use, you know. But it is tricky, though. You know, as musical description can only go so far with limited musical knowledge. So you have to keep it at a very basic level. You know, other questions that can be asked a lot of it ends up being yes or no questions, but then the idea is that by getting the students to answer these yes or no questions, you're then giving them the tools to be able to describe the music. So if they can tell you, so if you can ask a student, does this song contain a riff? Does this song contain call and response? What is the musical texture for this song? What patterns do you hear in the music? And then if you want to just ask a general question, you know, what word best describes this music? And then, you know, you could also have them compare it to another song. Does the song have a strong or light beat? That's a question I've started asking recently. Does the song have a heavy or a light beat? And that one's pretty easy for students to answer. Does the tempo change or stay the same? That's a good one. If you're playing music where the tempo changes, that's a good question you can ask. And that requires them to really listen to hear that. Do the dynamics get louder or softer? That's a good one. That really forces them to listen. And there's other questions that are similar that you can ask. Which instruments are most prominent in the song? Are there any solos in the song? Musical solos, like improvisation? What's the instrumentation? So once they can answer all those questions, then they can put that together into a musical description. Like, this song contains riffs. The instrumentation is piano, bass, and drums. The style of music for this song is rhythm and blues and jazz. Most songs will have multiple styles. If we're looking at the history of pop music, for example, or this song, the genres for this song are rock and roll, rhythm and blues, and traditional pop, you could say, right? As an example. So once they can explain and answer all those kind of yes or no questions, they can put that together in their own musical description in their own words, based on all that information that they know. Like knowing the genres, knowing the tempos, the harmony, how does it sound, major or minor, knowing the how the melody sounds, if it's going up or down in pitch, if there's solos in the music, if there's riffs, if there's motifs, if there's tempo changes, if there's call and response, if there's vocals, what are the vocals doing? Maybe there's scat singing. If they can answer all of this, then they can put that together towards doing a musical description analysis in their own words, while also using music vocabulary. So I think that's a good way to approach it. And it's always good to try and think of your own higher order thinking questions that can be asked about the music that won't be too advanced, and questions that are not going to overwhelm the students and go above their head regarding their own personal musical knowledge. So there we go. That's my opinion.